Now we have Brandon Comer, the co-founder of Shogun. And yeah, we are going to talk about how Shogun is building the web for the interchain, how they are building it. So yeah, let's give him an applause.
So my name's Brandon Comer. I'm the co-founder of Shogun, and what we do is we encourage people to think outside the blocks. And so what we're looking at is basically off-chain computation and on-chain verification. And so what that means is we do a lot of things with intents, but ultimately what we're trying to do is make it really easy to trade tokens across the board on any different ecosystem, between those ecosystems, on those ecosystems, and all the way in between. And so we started off with a very simple problem. On-chain trading is very difficult, even for crypto natives. And so like for us, we all basically, we're addicted to trading shitcoins at the end of the day, and I think a lot of people in the audience can kind of agree with that and kind of identify with that, especially in the last 3 months. But what we look at is, there's a high knowledge barrier when we're talking about trading on-chain. You have to do things like knowing which routes to take, knowing where to actually locate the tokens, and then take that a step further. And if you're doing cross-chain, you have to worry about different wallets, different ecosystem routes and stuff like that. And so all of these different bridges, all of these different interop solutions, they kind of add complexity to the situation where we're looking for simplicity ultimately. And so on top of that, you have the painful UX. There's long wait times. If you have to use, like, say, a native bridge, sometimes it's a 7-day settlement. And so things like that really impact the situation. And then finally, you have this being a growing issue. So you have things like modularity. You have things like different VMs being put on Ethereum, different VMs being put, like the Move ecosystem, for example, Movement Labs. And so all of these different things, they have like cool interoperability solutions within those ecosystems, but they don't necessarily have like a great solution to go from ecosystem to another one. And so that's where Shogun really wants to come in and change things. And so we started looking for inspiration, like what exists out there that we can take inspiration from that connects all these different individual networks and makes them into one unified thing. And so, of course, like most people in crypto, we looked at the internet, right? Like Web3, we usually look to Web2 for inspiration. And so, of course, we landed on TCP/IP, right? Like, this is what connects all of the internet, basically. You have this cool, like, application layer with HTTP that anyone can interact with. It's very standardized, and it's great across the board. Now, we looked at this and we were like, okay, well, can we take like sort of the Cosmos concept of the interchain and build something like a TCP/IP that kind of like encompasses this whole thing, like one unified application layer, essentially. But then there's this problem. There's a lot of application layers that already exist out there. And so you have things like the Arbitrum Orbit ecosystem, which is really great for spinning up like an L2 and L3, really easy to use, a lot of great chains, a lot of great activity there. But the problem there is, that's sort of an ecosystem in and of itself. How do you match that with something like Solana? How do you match that with something even crazier like, Bitcoin DeFi? That's a growing category at this point. You get the modular ecosystems involved. Some people even still use Cosmos. I'm just kidding there. But DYDX is obviously a huge project, and they're built on the Cosmos SDK, so is Hyperliquid. And so if you want to go back and forth between all these different things, it's really difficult right now. And so the ultimate solution that we saw was basically, how do you build the web for the interchain? And so what we mean by that is before the web came along for the internet, everyone that used the internet was basically some sort of like expert. They were either government organizations or people that were actually building stuff on top of the internet or just using it for very esoteric reasons. It wasn't like everyday users like normies or anything like that. The web came around and basically created this way that you could, make it very easy for people to interact with it. And you didn't have to have any special knowledge. You just had to type in www. And then put your URL in. And so that's exactly what we're trying to build here is, how do we get that type of experience with all of DeFi feeling like one single thing? And so a couple different inputs to get that end state. Number one, you need this integrated delivery system. So what I mean by that is, how do you take a user's request and take it from, say, a source chain to a destination chain? Or how do you take a user's request, make it gasless, make it as easy to use as possible, even when it's on the same chain? Additionally, what we found was there's a lot of great sort of pieces to this puzzle that have already been built. There's nothing that really solves the entire puzzle, but there's things like DeBridge that makes it really easy to go from Solana to the Ethereum ecosystem. There's things like Across that make sort of like cross-chain Ethereum trading pretty easy as well. But there's not really something that kind of encompasses all of it. So rather than rebuilding the wheel, we are aggregating those existing solutions, and we're building sort of the outside of that in terms of like intents or anything like that to go cross-chain and go intra-chain as well for things that don't exist in the ecosystems already. And finally, we needed a metric that ensures the user benefit. So like, we're not trying to blow smoke up anyone, you know. We want to make sure that people can very clearly see like the benefits of the system. And so we needed a metric that basically encompasses that. And so that's how we landed on our solution. And so we start with the hybrid flow optimization and settlement protocol, the HFSP. And so what this does is this is the delivery mechanism. And so what we do here is we combine basically intents. And so think about like filler liquidity, think about like P2P matching as well. And then we combine that with a smart order routing solution where you can basically take things that are already existing on chain, DEXs like Camelot, and routing solutions, and also matching that up with bridge aggregation as well. So being able to go from any chain, any token to another one with all the existing solutions right now, and that's great for long tail assets. And then finally, we added this concept of the JIT-LPs, so the just-in-time liquidity pools. And so what that allows you to do is have static liquidity that lives on any existing chain, and it's for two purposes. So on one side, it's like sort of an MEV reduction technique. You're basically giving people the optimal rate on something like this, so close to like a centralized exchange. But also on top of that, you can support really small ecosystems. So like with something like the Arbitrum L3s, right? You have things like Sanko, things like Zai, things like even like Cheese Chain, if we want to get really into the memes. And so something like that, it's really difficult to get a solver who wants to put like a maximum amount of liquidity on something like that. And so rather than doing that, we can do something like the JIT-LPs, get some protocol and liquidity in there, or get some static LPs with some incentives. And then you have a full-scale system where you can basically trade on any chain that we can support. And so finally, we get to the metric, right? And so we came up with this kind of meme concept of trader extractable value. And so what this is based on is, you take like MEV and you apply it to, say, the global context of like, how do you sort of take MEV and make it more trader focused? And so we came up with this where basically a lot of our solutions rely on Dutch auctions where you start at the maximum price, you kind of move down further and further, and then as soon as someone, like a solver, is willing to accept that price, they bid on it and they win that auction. And so what you have is this sort of metric where you have the trader's request on the left. This is like their limit order price. And then you have the auction start price, which is a little higher always. And then somewhere between that, someone's going to fill that order. And so that's where this TEV comes in. And so our goal here is to use solver competition, to use the JIT-LP vaults, to use everything that we have to basically maximize how close we get to that auction start price versus to the actual limit price that they're actually using. Now, this is a generalized concept. We start with trading. We start with specifically spot trading. And we can apply this, though, to pretty much any metric. So a lot of times you talk about intents, and it's like, are intents just limit orders? Well, right now they pretty much are. But you can do this in Shogun with any metric. So you can optimize for speed, for example. Whoever's willing to fill it the fastest, you can do that. You can also take this concept and apply it to really sort of niche apps. Like, so say, for example, you wanted to build something that aggregates based on a different metric. As long as you define that metric and you can find a solver in our marketplace to match that, you can have this be based on any parameter that's supported. Now, a couple of the cool things that we're working on that are very different from some of the solver tech that exists today is we're trying to make these sort of niche and very practical changes that can make trading better for everyone, but also kind of impact the solver side so they can solve things that maybe they weren't able to before. And so you start with things like this. So centralized exchanges always have typically like the best exchange rates for especially major assets. And so if we can take that concept and apply it to the solver mechanism, if you're familiar with like Coinbase, for example, they just recently introduced this concept of magic spend where you can take your on-chain, you can take your Coinbase balances and you can use them to trade on-chain. And so our question was, okay, that's cool, but the bigger sort of impact for us is, especially with price, is if centralized exchanges have the best exchange rates, can you take what's on chain and can you rebalance it with what's on that centralized exchange to basically give the users on chain those centralized exchange rates? And so ultimately what we got is this. And so what we're doing with a couple like very large scale liquid funds and market makers is we're working on basically streaming prices from centralized exchanges and then automating the API to trade on those centralized exchanges so they can do something like this. And so what this involves is typically there's something like SexDex arbitrage where some sort of large trading firm will arbitrage between the exchange rates on a DEX and on a centralized exchange. What we're trying to do is basically take that and apply it to the actual user's request. And so if you go back to that TEV meme, you basically try to get people to fill those rates on chain at those centralized exchange rates and then rebalance using their own accounts on those centralized exchanges. And so this is how we get closer to more centralized exchange type exchange rates on chain. And it's also just a better experience as well when you consider price. Now, the whole goal of Shogun, we talked about think outside the blocks. This is all about on-chain settlement and on-chain verification and settlement and also off-chain computation. And so what we're trying to do there is we're trying to play to blockchain strengths, which is verifying, which is settlement, making it open, making it transparent so that you can't have like an FTX situation, right? But then off-chain is really where that computation shines. You can do things like AI, you can do things like machine learning, and these really complex computations that you can't really do on-chain because they're too expensive either, or they take too many resources. And it's just easier if you can work with protocols that have this off-chain experience and can bring that into an on-chain context. And so what I mean by that is we have folks like the OMO protocol who are building like AI agents, for example. And so what AI agents do is they automate the process for, say, DeFi. Maybe it's aggregating liquidity. Maybe it's routing trades that maybe the human mind can't really comprehend. Maybe it's multi-steps that are beyond what we would typically do with routing. And so having AI agents kind of hook into these user intents, being solvers essentially, that's a huge innovation that we can do, where we can just solve things that aren't really practical with the existing infrastructure today. We also have people like Theo Network who are interested in innovating on the solver side and on the app side as well. And so ultimately what Shogun is, in the long run, in the long-term vision, is a marketplace for intent-centric apps and solvers to find each other. And it's just making the mechanisms as easy as possible so even the most unsophisticated, untech-savvy person can run a solver and build an application that uses this intent infrastructure to complete it. And so ultimately, when you finally get to that vision of like what we're trying to do, we want to do something like this. And so everything is served through an API. Everything is available. It's open source in terms of like documentation, everything like that. And you get to something like this where Camelot can even use our API to add a cross-chain context where you don't have to switch between like a Sanko chain for DMT or switch to Zai to trade it. You can trade them right from the same interface using our UI. And it's not cannibalizing any of their liquidity or any of their volume because we're still using their DEXs to fill this. But all we're adding is basically this cross-chain aspect where you can settle to anywhere and go from any source chain to destination chain. It doesn't even have to be within the Arbitrum L3 ecosystem. You can add Solana trading in here. You can add pretty much anything that you can think of. And so that's the end vision of Shogun, and that's basically what we're delivering now. We have the aggregator of aggregators basically out now with Arbitrum and Base. And we're expanding that to Solana, expanding it to the Move ecosystem, and also working with a couple folks like the Ton ecosystem and so forth to get to there. And that's going to be it. So thank you all. If you want to try out any of our solutions, the Shogun Trading Bot is a Telegram bot that you can sign up right now. You can trade cross-chain between Arbitrum and Base with no switching of chains, no anything like that. We handle the API list exactly for you, and it's all available there. Thank you, everybody.